In this video, I'm going to be talking about the differences between Photoshop and Illustrator. And I'm going to be not only explaining the differences between what these two tools are typically used for, but I'll do my best to highlight why you should use one tool or another for certain tasks. And also there were some questions that were sent to me around, hey, if I was only going to pick one tool to subscribe to, which one would you pick and why? That's ultimately a super difficult question because I use these two together all the time, but I will talk through the pros and cons for each individual program and we can just go from there. So when you're really thinking about the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator, there's a couple words that come to mind that really set these apart. So for Photoshop, that word is raster. Photoshop was built, not surprisingly, for photos, and therefore it uses a pixel-based format for showing images. And this gets a bit complicated because you can also bring vectors into Photoshop, and you can make vectors inside Photoshop as well. If you use the shape tools or the pen tool, those will create vectors. But the important thing to keep in mind is this was built to be a raster or pixel-based program. So I have a high resolution photo open in Photoshop to show this. So at a distance way back, this looks like a typical photo. It looks very sharp, like it's in a good high resolution. And if I zoom in to 100%, you can see that it still looks nice and sharp. But let's just keep zooming in further and further and see what happens. So as you keep going in to this particular photo, the pixels that make up this photo become much more apparent. So in this case, it becomes a highly abstracted image of just different blue gradients, but these are all the individual pixels that make up this photo. So this is the core of how Photoshop works. It's built to help you create images that are based on a bunch of different pixels, and then it gives you a ton of options for manipulating how those pixels look and work together to ultimately form an image. So when you think Photoshop, think photo. It's not surprising. Of course, you can do all sorts of stuff in Photoshop. Even text in Photoshop is a vector because of how that text is built and how it's rendered inside the program. But I'll just jump to Illustrator really quick to show a difference. So inside Illustrator, we also have an image right here just to show you can even do some pretty basic filters on images. If you go to Effect, and then in the bottom, there's Photoshop effects, where you can go through different effects that are typically for Photoshop, but you can, and this entire interface, I should say too, looks like a Photoshop interface as opposed to an Illustrator interface. But you can do some basic filters here. You can apply them and then they will apply inside Illustrator. So it's not like you can't do some of the cool stuff in Illustrator that you can do in Photoshop. The tool just wasn't initially built for this. What it was built for is vector-based workflow. So if you're familiar with the pen tool inside Illustrator, what you do is you make points. So every time you click, it makes a point, and then you can make another point and it will connect it with a line. That line could be straight, it could be curved. Ultimately, that's just how this particular program works. So when you think of vector, it's a bunch of points inside the program that basically build out a shape or an illustration or whatever the case might be. And that's how the program knows what you're drawing. It considers the location of the points in relation to each other, and then also the lines or curves that connect those points. So the cool thing here is that when you draw any shape inside Illustrator, like this beautiful thing I just made here, it will be infinitely rescalable. You can make this as big as you want and it will never ever lose any quality or sharpness. So if I make this huge, I'll just keep making this thing huger and huger, and then I zoom in on the edges. Also, it appears that my fill is a different color, but everything is still sharp. And we're at 600% now. And you can actually zoom in super crazy far in Illustrator. It turns out, I didn't even know you could go to 64,000%, but you can do that. So these edges are still absolutely crisp at 64,000%. And that's a big difference between something you might draw in Illustrator versus something that you might draw in Photoshop. And just to highlight that, if I were to turn off this image and then I'm going to use a paintbrush, I'm just going to switch so my paintbrush is black and then I'll make it a little bit bigger. If I draw a wonderful shape using my paintbrush inside Photoshop, this is fantastic. I should sell this once I'm done. And then I start to zoom in on those edges. And this is going to be very, very different than what you found inside Illustrator. So right now we're at 3,200%. We're at 12,800%. So you can see in the core, it's still a pretty rich dark black, but as the edges go out, it starts to blend out into grays until it eventually turns into a white. So that'll make this look fuzzy if you were to make this really large. So right now this is at 100%. I'm just going to make this something stupid like 10,000%. Ooh, that's too big. Let's say 1,000%. I'll hit OK. And now I'm just going to move this until we can find some of those edges. So you can see at, let's go to 100%, these edges now look very soft and pixelated and faded as opposed to the nice sharp shape that we had before. So when you start thinking about the differences in Photoshop versus Illustrator, it is important to keep in mind that when you draw things in a pixel-based format, you're not going to be able to rescale them larger without losing quality. It's just not going to happen. But I also have an example of my logo inside Photoshop. I actually drew this in Illustrator and then just copy and pasted it right into Photoshop. I do that all the time. But this is a vector smart object. So the edges on this, and this is at 300%, so these will look a little bit blurry. That is a difference between Photoshop and Illustrator 2. You can zoom in forever and ever in Illustrator and things will never look blurry, assuming they're vector. Not the case in Photoshop. So at 100%, everything looks nice and sharp. And even if I make this particular one really big, this is at 308% right now, but I'll make this 3000% because I can. I'll hit OK. The edges at 100% still look super nice and sharp because this is a vector object that was brought into Photoshop. So if you bring vector objects into Photoshop or you create vector objects inside Photoshop, you do have the benefit that those will still function very similar to a vector object in Illustrator. Not any difference, except unless you try to zoom in crazy far, in which case you'll start to get that pixelation. So for example, if I go to the toolbar inside Photoshop and I want to draw a shape, there's a custom shape tool. I haven't used that before. Apparently it wants to draw a tree. So it'll draw a tree for me really easily. And this is going to be a vector object. Buffalo Thorn Tree 1. I really wonder why it drew a tree. Anyways, I will make this one 1000% just to show that you can make this huge and those edges will still be sharp. Now this is a pretty rough vector illustration, so it looks really weird and funky in terms of how the actual leaves and stuff look on this. But you can even see in the off screen where this is outside of my canvas, you can see all the individual points that make up the vector object, and then they're connected through lines, which ultimately create that shape. So it's not impossible to draw vectors in Photoshop, just not what this tool was initially built for. And you'll find, at least in my experience, I find that Illustrator is a far more easy and enjoyable tool to use for creating any sort of vector artwork. But let's say you do have a photo like this in Photoshop and you want to change the color a little bit. In Photoshop, you can just hit a shortcut, Control U for hue saturation, and then I can adjust the hue on the fly. This is actually a super powerful effect that I'm doing in real time, and it's so easy to do in Photoshop, you don't even think about it. But if I were to try to do that exact same effect in Illustrator, I honestly don't know how. I don't know if you can do a hue saturation inside Illustrator. And let's say I were to want to do that to my logo in Illustrator and check out what a bunch of different hues or tones might look like on it. All I can do right now is open up the color picker, or I could also use swatches. There's different ways of doing this, but the point still applies. I can manually go over to these different colors, find a color I think looks okay, hit OK, and it will change. But if I were to do that same task inside Photoshop, and here's an interesting part too. For me to do that inside Photoshop, I'm actually gonna have to right click this layer and then rasterize it. So it'll now be pixel based as opposed to the vector smart object. I'll hit Control U once again, and I can just very quickly go through and check through a bunch of different color combinations to see one that I like. So when I'm trying to accomplish tasks like that, I might very well draw the object inside Illustrator. But when it comes to attempting to find the perfect color, I love using hue saturation to do that. And Photoshop is fantastic as a tool for doing that. So I think you'll start to see a really big theme here that no single one of these two different tools is ideal or perfect for everything. It's sort of a balance between what these tools are and aren't good for, and then you're just trying to use them the best way that you can to get the results that you need. Personally, when I'm designing almost anything, at least for my style of work, which typically tends to be things like typography or more simple shapes, I'm not a strong illustrator in the typical sense. I much prefer to work with solid shapes rather than sketching or drawing or other things that we might think of a bit more when we think of illustration. So almost always I will build out my initial designs inside Illustrator. I'll do the layouts, I'll get everything arranged in a way that I like. And if that's all I have to do, I can actually finish that design inside Illustrator without bringing in anything else or worrying about anything else. But there's many cases too where maybe I have a logo and then I want to bring that logo into Photoshop and then apply a cool distress texture on top of it. So if I look for a brush really quick here that should hopefully have some sort of a fade or an effect, I'll just use this one and then kind of go over it. That actually looks pretty solid, but I'll just zoom in here and look for another brush that might have a little bit more strangeness going on. So maybe this one. So for example, this texture that I'm making, it's not going to look too good, but you can see it looks very soft. And actually the combination of these two different textures illustrates my point fairly well. So for these lines that I made before that have a very stark contrast between the solid colors, there's not a lot of gray or diffusion between them. It's just a solid white versus a solid orange. Where the second brush that I did has a very soft texture to it. So the opacity changes, the amount of orange that it's knocking out changes, the overall colors of the white change as it sort of fades between that orange and pure white. These solid ones would be fantastic to do in Illustrator. And that way you'd also have an object that you could expand forever and ever, and you would never ever lose image quality, which is a huge perk. Where if I wanted to achieve a result like this inside Illustrator, I for sure could if I wanted to spend the time drawing all these lines, individually coloring all those lines to make that sort of blended look. It's possible, it'd just be a really bad use of my time, unless I absolutely needed this particular image to be infinitely rescalable, which is a huge consideration of when you use Photoshop versus when you use Illustrator. If you want an image to be infinitely rescalable, which typically if you're doing something like a logo, that's a huge perk. You want the client to be able to use that logo at any scale they want, including if it's a billboard or on the side of a skyscraper. Where in Photoshop, you're working within a set canvas size. So this canvas size is 2000 by 2000 pixels. And assuming I'm not drawing using vector artwork inside this, that is the highest quality resolution that this work will ever be, because if I try to scale it larger, sure you can, but you'll always lose quality. Sort of similar to when you just zoom in Photoshop. It's like every time you zoom in past 100%, things get more and more pixelated, more and more blurry. The same thing will happen when you enlarge it. And when it comes to an idea of if you could only pick one of these two programs, which would you pick? Would you pick Photoshop or would you pick Illustrator? I think that's almost an impossible question because for my workflow, I use the two together constantly. And to show that workflow, right here I have a YouTube thumbnail that I made where I actually made all this type, the logo, and even the Illustrator logo, which I obviously didn't make. These are all vector objects that were then brought into Photoshop. But then the texture in the background, for example, that has these slight shadows, there's a texture to it overall. It's a really great thing to do stuff like that inside Photoshop. And I also had some textures I was going to play around with and apply to this particular type when I was trying to figure out how to best display it. So I have an example. I'll just move that mask over and show you what that looks like. So texture like this, and this is at 200%, so it looks a little bit blurry, but this texture has soft edges. It doesn't have really harsh edges, and I wouldn't be able to achieve that kind of softness inside Illustrator. And just to try to show what that would hypothetically look like as I move these levels, it starts to look much more stark. So if I turn that preview on and off, you can see the difference in basically what I would have got if I were doing this in Illustrator versus the much more soft look that you get inside Photoshop. So it's like you can do both inside either program, but each tool is a little bit better at different things, and you might as well use both together to get the maximum benefits. But just to summarize everything we've seen so far, because there's quite a lot to reflect on and consider. So reason to use Photoshop are, of course, when you're working on photos, when you're doing complex recoloring, if you want to do some really cool texture effects or gradations that would just be more difficult to do inside Illustrator, and also when the resizability or rescalability of the final product doesn't matter that much. If you know how big something has to be, like an 11 by 17 poster, it's no problem whether you do that in Illustrator or Photoshop as long as you build the document size correctly. When it comes to Illustrator, if you want sharp, crisp lines that will be that way no matter at what scale, for example, this logo could be as big as the planet and it would still be completely sharp. That's the cool thing about a vector program. And generally, I just find doing things like typography to be much more pleasant inside Illustrator, or doing any kind of line work. For whatever reason, I greatly prefer using the pen tool inside Illustrator as opposed to Photoshop. It's just much more flexible, much more adjustable and editable. And if you're trying to pick one program or the other, I would really encourage you to do your best to use both, unless you're financially blocked and you don't want to pay for a subscription for both programs or all of Creative Cloud. You just have to balance what is the kind of work you're doing and what's most important for that work. If you're doing a lot of typography, a lot of hard-lined illustration, I think Illustrator is obviously a great tool for that. As opposed to Photoshop, if you like doing complex texture work, if you're working with photos a lot, if you love manipulating colors and doing special effects, Photoshop is a tool built for that. And of course, there's also Lightroom. If you're a pure photographer, then that's probably the right tool for you. But there's a trade-off, there's a balance, and it's up to you to really decide that balance. But that's really all I have to say here. So I do hope that this video was helpful to you. And if it was, please consider subscribing. I do my best to keep creating new content just like this. And also, if it was helpful, hit the thumbs up button to let me know that you liked the video. And of course, if you have further questions or comments, leave those in the comments section. Either I or somebody else might be able to help you. That is it for me for now. Thank you so much for watching.